The cemetery sat at the eastern edge of Harlan County, where the blacktop turned to gravel and the land opened wide into flat winter fields. It was the second Tuesday of November, cold enough that Nora Voss could see her breath when she exhaled, and the wind kept pulling dead leaves across the tops of the headstones in long, lazy arcs. 14 people came. Nora counted them the way she always counted things she couldn't control, quietly, methodically giving her hands something to do, even when her hands were folded still at her sides. 14. For a man who had spent 33 years fixing things, other people gave up on, who had kept a welding shop running through 3 recessions in a flood that took out the back wall of the building, who had driven 40 miles in a January ice storm because a farmer's irrigation line had cracked and the cattle needed water by morning. 14 people. Walter's casket was pine with a clear finish. He would have wanted that. He never liked anything that announced itself. The pastor read from Ecclesiastes and kept it under 10 minutes, which Walter also would have wanted. Nora stood at the front with her hands folded over each other. She wore the black dress she had bought for her own mother's funeral 6 years ago. It still fit. She had not eaten much in the past week, and the dress hung a little looser than she remembered, but she had not noticed until she was already in the truck on the way to the cemetery, and by then it didn't matter. Clifford stood on the far side of the grave. He was Walter's older brother by 4 years, and he had the kind of posture that men develop when they spend 30 years in sales, shoulders back, chin level, a permanent readiness to extend a hand and introduce himself. He wore a sport coat Nora had never seen before, charcoal wool expensive. Beside him stood Agnes, their mother, 81 years old and wrapped in a camel-colored coat that had once fit her properly but now swallowed her small frame. Agnes was having a clear day. Nora could tell from the way her eyes tracked the pastor, following the words present in the way she sometimes wasn't anymore. The man in the gray suit stood just behind Clifford. Nora didn't recognize him. He held a leather folder under one arm and kept his eyes moving across the small crowd with the practiced neutrality of someone paid to observe and not react. She assumed he was one of Clifford's real estate contacts. Clifford was always working a deal, always positioned next to someone useful. She didn't think much of it. After the service, people filed past Nora and said the things people say at funerals. She thanked each of them by name when she knew their names and thanked them simply when she didn't. A woman from the church Walter had attended as a boy brought a foil pan of scalloped potatoes. A rancher named Earl Pickett, who had brought his livestock trailer in twice a year for weld repairs on the gate hinges, squeezed Nora's hand and said, "There wasn't a better man in this county." His voice broke on the last word. He looked embarrassed by it. Nora said, "I know. Thank you, Earl." Clifford came over last. He waited until the other mourners had drifted back toward their trucks, until it was just the two of them and Agnes standing at the edge of the grave. Agnes had taken Clifford's arm and was leaning against him slightly, looking at the casket with an expression Nora couldn't read. "We'll talk tomorrow," Clifford said. He touched Nora's shoulder once, brief and firm, the way a man touches something he's already categorized. "Get some rest." "Thank you, Clifford." He walked Agnes back to his sedan. The man in the gray suit followed them. Nora watched them go and felt nothing in that moment except tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. The other kind, the kind that has been building for a week and has settled into the bones and doesn't care what you do about it. She drove home in Walter's truck. The house was a 2-bedroom ranch on a half-acre lot with white siding and green shutters, a back porch Walter had built himself the summer they moved in, and a garden Nora had put in the following spring and kept going every year since. 33 years of roses along the south fence, tomatoes in raised beds, herbs in terracotta pots. She moved inside every October. She parked in the driveway and sat in the truck for a long time. Inside, the house smelled like Walter. His coffee mug sat on the counter, rinsed but not washed. She had left it there on purpose. His work boots sat by the back door with the laces still tied the way he always left them, loose enough to step in and out without bending down. She had left those there on purpose, too. She walked through every room. She touched the doorframe of the hallway where Walter had penciled both their heights on their first anniversary as a joke, his mark a full 6 inches above hers. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his pillow. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with the overhead light on, and made coffee and drank it until the pot was empty, and then made another. Sometime around 3 in the morning, she opened the refrigerator and looked at the pan of scalloped potatoes and closed the refrigerator again. The house was very quiet. She could hear the furnace cycling on and off. She could hear the wind working at the corner of the back porch where the flashing had been loose for 2 years, and Walter had kept meaning to fix it. She had a list on the counter, things that needed doing. She had started it 2 days ago because she needed something concrete to look at. Water the herbs, call the insurance company, find the deed, return Earl Pickett's condolence call. The list was 12 items long and she had not crossed off a single one. The doorbell rang at 7 the next morning. Nora was still in her clothes from the funeral. She had not showered. She opened the front door and found 3 men on the porch. Clifford stood in front. He was wearing a tie, which was unusual for a Wednesday. Behind him stood the man in the gray suit from the cemetery, the one with the leather folder. Behind that man stood a third person Nora had never seen, heavy-set, middle-aged, carrying a canvas tool bag by its handles. Nora, Clifford said. "This is Warren Holt." He gestured to the man in the gray suit. "He's the family attorney." Warren Holt stepped forward and extended his hand. His grip was measured and brief. "Mrs. Voss, I'm very sorry for your loss. I need to walk you through some documents this morning. May we come in?" Nora looked past them at the driveway. Agnes was in Clifford's sedan with the engine running. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield. "What's going on, Clifford?" It wasn't a question. Clifford heard that. "Can we sit down?" he said. They came inside. Warren Holt set his leather folder on the kitchen table and spread it open. The third man stayed on the front porch. Nora could hear him unzipping his tool bag. She looked at the open doorway. "Who is that?" she said. "He's a locksmith," Clifford said. "We'll get to that." Nora looked at Clifford. "Sit down," he said again. She didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of the kitchen and waited. Warren Holt spoke in the practiced tone of a man who had delivered this kind of news before and learned to keep it flat because flatness was the only thing that didn't make it worse. "Mrs. Voss, the property you're standing in the welding business. Your husband operated under the name Voss Custom Metalworks, and all equipment and fixtures associated with that business are held in an entity called the Voss Family Trust. The trust was established in 1979 by Walter and Agnes Voss." Nora looked at Clifford. 1979, the attorney continued. 12 years before you and Walter married. "I know when we got married," Nora said. "Under the terms of the trust, upon the death of any beneficiary, that beneficiary's interest passes to the surviving beneficiaries. The surviving beneficiaries are Agnes Voss and Clifford Voss. Your name does not appear in the trust document, Mrs. Voss. You are not a beneficiary. You are not a trustee." Nora pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down. The chair legs scraped against the tile floor. The sound was very loud in the quiet kitchen. "Walter never told me about a trust," she said. Clifford cleared his throat. "It was Dad's idea originally. He set it up before he passed. Walter kept it going. Its standard estate planning protects family assets, ensures continuity. Walter kept it going." She said it the way you repeat something you need to hear twice to understand what it actually means. "The trust is the controlling document here," Warren Holt said. "The house, the shop, the equipment, the client accounts, all trust assets." Nora looked at the kitchen counter. Walter's coffee mug, the one with the chipped handle he'd refused to throw away for a decade because he said a chip doesn't mean it's broken. Everything she said. "I ran those books for 33 years, Clifford. I did the payroll and the quarterly taxes and the inventory and the supply orders. I answered the phone at 2 in the morning when somebody's fence post anchor cracked in January. I set up the first shop. I found the lease and negotiated it and built the client list from 11 accounts to over 90. Clifford looked at the table. "I understand that," he said. "Do you?" "Mrs. Voss." Warren Holt's voice was careful. "This is not a reflection of your contributions to the family or the business. The trust was structured before your marriage and was never amended to include you. That's an oversight that unfortunately cannot be corrected after the fact." An oversight. From the front porch, she heard the locksmith working, the sound of a drill finding purchase in a doorframe, then metal sliding against metal. "We've had the locks rekeyed," Clifford said. He said it quickly. "You have until noon to collect your personal belongings." Nora looked at the clock on the kitchen wall. 7:24. "Noon," she said. "I can extend that to 1," Warren Holt offered. "That's generous," Nora said. Her voice was steady. She surprised herself with that. Clifford stood. "I'm sorry, Nora. I really am. This is just how the trust is structured." She didn't answer him. She looked at the coffee mug and thought about what belonged to the trust and what didn't, and whether that distinction meant anything in a house where every object carried 33 years of ordinary life behind it. Clifford and Warren Holt went outside. She heard them on the porch in low voices, a tone she recognized from years of family dinners where decisions had already been made in parking lots before anyone sat down to eat. She started in the bedroom. Her clothes from the closet and the dresser went into two suitcases she'd kept on the high shelf since their last trip, which had been 4 years ago. She took her jewelry box, pearl earrings from her mother, a watch her father had worn during his 20 years driving long-haul freight across the Midwest, and had given her when his eyes got too bad to see the face clearly. She took a photo album from the hallway shelf. Her family, her history, the years that existed before Voss. She went to the garage and found Walter's old welding hood hanging on the nail by the door, the first one he'd ever owned. Cracked lens. He kept it for the same reason he kept the chipped mug, because things that have done their work deserve to stay. She took it. She left the wedding photos on the living room wall. She left the kitchen she had remodeled herself, counters tile, backsplash cabinet hardware she had picked out and installed over 2 weekends while Walter ran wire for the new range. All of it inside the trust's walls now. All of it belonging to Clifford and Agnes. She carried a box to the front porch. Clifford was leaning against his sedan with his arms crossed, watching the locksmith finish the back door. As Nora passed, Agnes rolled down the passenger window. She held out a black plastic garbage bag. "For the rest of your things, dear," Agnes said. There was no cruelty in her voice. She said it the way she might offer someone a glass of water. Practical, absent the gesture of a woman who wasn't fully tracking what was happening, or perhaps had decided not to fully track it. Nora took the bag. "Thank you, Agnes," she said. She went back inside and filled it. Some shoes, a bathrobe, a heating pad she used for her lower back on the bad mornings. She tied the bag shut and carried it out. The locksmith handed Clifford 2 new keys and a receipt. Clifford signed without looking. Nora loaded her suitcases and the box in the garbage bag into the bed of the truck. Walter's truck, the dark blue F250 he had driven for 16 years, maintained with the same methodical care he applied to everything. New plugs every 30,000 miles, differential fluid on schedule, a spare set of wiper blades behind the seat because you never knew. She stopped and opened the glove box, pulled out the registration. Walter Voss, personal vehicle, their home address, no mention of any trust. She checked it twice. The truck was Walter's personally, registered to him as an individual. Not to the trust, not to the business, not to any entity with Clifford's name attached to it. They had missed it. Whatever they had cataloged and claimed and locked the doors on, they had missed the truck sitting in the driveway with 16 years of Walter's careful maintenance and a wool blanket behind the seat. Nora folded the registration, put it back, and closed the glove box. She started the engine and backed out of the driveway slowly. She did not wave. She did not look at the house again. She turned east onto the county road and drove, and the key ring swung from the rearview mirror with the motion of the truck, catching the November light swinging back and forth in a slow, steady rhythm. 3 keys on the ring. The house key was useless now. The truck key was in the ignition. The 3rd key was brass small, older than the others, worn smooth on the bow from years of contact with a hand that was no longer here. Walter had told her about it exactly once, maybe 10 years back, when she'd asked while they were standing in the kitchen after dinner. She had been looking at the key ring on the counter and noticed the small brass one didn't match the others. "What's that one for?" she'd said. Just storage, Walter said. Out on the county road. Junk, mostly. He had changed the subject before she could follow up. And after enough years of marriage, you learned which doors to knock on and which ones to walk past. There were things Walter didn't press her about either. It balanced out. She drove east on the county road for 20 minutes. The land out here was flat and wide winter fields stretching in every direction. A grain elevator visible 3 miles off to the north. A white clapboard church sitting alone at a crossroads with a gravel parking lot and no cars. At mile marker 11, she saw the turnoff. A dirt track, 2 ruts with dead grass growing between them. A leaning mailbox with no name on it, the flag broken off and never replaced. She turned in. The truck moved slowly over the ruts for a quarter-mile. The scrub land on either side was overgrown goldenrod and thistle gone brown and brittle in the cold wild sumac, with its red seed clusters, a rusted farm implement half buried in the weeds that she couldn't identify from the cab. At the end of the track, there was a chain-link fence 5 feet tall, leaning at odd angles where the post had shifted in the clay soil. A gate hung on one hinge open. Beyond it sat the Quonset, corrugated steel half-round, maybe 40 feet long and 20 wide. Rust had streaked down the walls in long orange trails from every seam and bolt head. 2 small windows along the south wall, filthy with years of road dust. A sliding door at the front closed with a padlock. Nora parked the truck and got out. The wind was cold with nothing to break it. She walked through the weeds to the door and held up the brass key. It fit the padlock. She turned it and the lock opened. She grabbed the door handle and pulled. The steel groaned against its track, resisting, and then gave way and slid sideways on its rollers, and the November light poured into the interior. Nora stood in the doorway and stared. She had expected junk. Broken equipment, old lumber, the kind of accumulation that happens when a man buys a property and never quite gets around to dealing with it. Clifford had called it the junk shed once years ago in passing when the subject had come up at a family dinner. Walter had not corrected him. He had looked at his plate and let the description stand, and now she understood why. What she found was a workshop, clean, organized, deliberate. A welding station ran along the left wall, a MIG setup and a stick welder both on rolling carts, with the torch heads capped and the gas lines coiled and clamped. A tool wall took up the entire right side. Pegboard from floor to ceiling with hooks, and on every hook a tool in its place. Wrenches sorted by size and type. Files in a row handled down. Chisels, clamps, hammers laid flat in ascending size. And beneath each hook, a label in Walter's handwriting, small, careful block letters. The same hand that had written estimates and invoices and purchase orders for 33 years. A workbench stretched across the back wall. Steel top, drawers underneath. Nora walked to it and pulled the first drawer. Drill bits sorted by diameter in a fitted foam insert. She opened the second grinding disc, still in factory packaging, sorted by grit. She went through drawer after drawer. Measuring tools, soapstone markers, welding rods sealed in labeled cans. Spare contact tips for the MIG gun organized by wire diameter. Spare nozzles, anti-spatter spray. A small notebook with crimp-style covers that turned out to be a consumables log. Each entry in Walter's block print date and item and quantity. This was not a junk shed. This was where Walter really worked. He had built this place over years, equipped it with the care of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly why they were doing it here and not somewhere else. And he had never told her. Not his mother, not Clifford, and from everything Nora could see standing in the middle of this floor, not her either. She stood in the center of the concrete and turned slowly, taking it in. The overhead fluorescence flickered once and then steadied when she found the switch on the wall near the door. He had run electricity out here. She checked the wall behind the welding station and found a 220-volt outlet with a proper breaker box mounted above it, everything labeled and clean. She said his name out loud into the empty building. The steel walls held the sound for a moment and then let it go. She walked back to the workbench. Something caught her eye below the bench surface, pushed against the wall in the shadow beneath the lower shelf. She crouched down and looked. A steel box. maybe 18 inches long, 12 wide, 8 deep, set on the concrete floor with the careful placement of something that had been put there on purpose and left for someone specific to find. She pulled it out, heavy. She set it on the workbench surface and tried the lid with both hands. Solid. She looked at the seam where the lid met the body of the box. A weld ran continuously around all four edges. Not a tack, not a spot weld, a full bead 3 passes at least tight, and even with a slight ripple in the pattern that she recognized without having to think about it. She had teased him about that ripple for 33 years. He called it his signature. She called it the thing he could never quite train out of his right hand. They had argued about it, laughed about it, let it become one of those small private jokes that couples accumulate over decades. The way a riverbank accumulates silt slowly without noticing until one day it's just part of the landscape. The ripple was his. Nora pressed her palms flat against the top of the box and stood there with her eyes closed for a moment. Her legs ached. Her back ached. She had not slept in 2 days, and she had not eaten since yesterday morning. She was 59 years old, and she was standing in a steel building in a scrubland field with a garbage bag full of shoes in the bed of her dead husband's truck, and everything else she had built for 33 years locked behind a door she no longer had a key for. She looked at the tool wall. A 4-inch angle grinder hung on its hook with a cutting disc already mounted. She could open the box in 5 minutes. But her hands were shaking and the light through the small windows was already turning amber, and the Quonset had no heat, and she could feel the cold working up through the concrete through the soles of her shoes. She wasn't going to open it tonight. Not like this. Not shaking, not in the dark, not without being able to see clearly what was inside and what it meant. She locked the Quonset door. She walked back to the F250 and climbed into the cab. Behind the seat, folded into the space between the seat back and the rear window, was the wool blanket Walter kept there for roadside emergencies. He had kept a blanket behind the seat for as long as she had known him. He said it was practical. She had never needed it for a roadside breakdown. She needed it now. She pulled it around her shoulders and leaned the seat back as far as it would go. The blanket smelled like the truck, like diesel, and something faintly metallic, and underneath that, something else she couldn't name with certainty, the residue of him, maybe the quality of a smell you only notice when you're trying to hold on to it. She slept harder than she expected. When she opened her eyes, the cab windows were fogged with her breath, and pale morning light came through the windshield, and her neck was stiff, and her lower back was complaining about the seat frame, and she didn't care about any of it. She wiped the fog from the glass and looked out at the Quonset. It sat low in the November morning, the corrugated steel walls catching the early sun and holding it orange and rust and the cold glint of metal. 2 acres of scrub land and chain link around it. And somewhere in the county records in a filing she had not known about until this moment, her name on the deed. She climbed out and stretched. The cold air was sharp and clean. She walked around to the truck bed and found the toolbox bolted to the rail under the tarp, Walter's roadside kit. Socket-set crescent wrenches, pliers, zip ties, electrical tape. And beside the toolbox, half covered by the same tarp, the portable angle grinder with a cutting disc already mounted. He had kept a grinder in the truck bed. Of course he had. She carried it inside. The outlet by the workbench was live. Walter had kept the electrical account active on this property. She plugged in the grinder and tested it, and the disc spun up loud in the curved space of the building, the sound bouncing off the steel walls and filling the space, the way sounds fill spaces that have been quiet for a long time. She set the box on the workbench and tilted it under the fluorescent light and looked at the weld again. 3 passes. Good penetration. He had run it thick on purpose, made it something that would take real work to open, something that would stop anyone who didn't know what they were looking at or why it mattered. Nora put on Walter's welding hood, the one she had carried out of the house in a garbage bag less than 24 hours ago, the one with the cracked lens he had kept for sentiment. She pressed the grinder to the seam. The weld fought her for 20 minutes. She worked in short passes, letting the steel cool between cuts, keeping the disc at the right angle to chew through the bead without warping the box beneath it. Sparks bounced off the hood and scattered across her jacket and died on the concrete. She had done this before. She knew how to read the resistance, how to feel when the disc was through the fill and into the cap, and when to ease off before she went too deep. When the last section gave way, she pried the lid up with a flathead from the bench drawer. 3 items inside. Pack carefully the way you pack something you want someone to find in good condition years after you've put it there. A thick manila envelope on top. A leather-bound journal beneath it, the spine cracked from use. A sealed letter resting against the side of the box with her name written on the front. Not Nora Voss, just Nora. His handwriting small and square and careful, the hand that had labeled every hook in every drawer in this building and written every estimate for every job for 33 years. She picked up the manila envelope first. She unsealed it and slid the contents onto the workbench surface. The life insurance policy was on top, $180,000. Beneficiary Nora Voss. She read it twice. The policy was dated 2006, which she remembered because 2006 was the year she had gone into the hospital in February with pneumonia that had taken 6 weeks to clear and had left her with a cough that lasted until April. She remembered Walter sitting in the hospital room on the second day with the particular stillness he had when he was thinking hard about something and not ready to talk about it yet. She had not known what he was thinking about. She knew now. The policy had been issued to Walter Voss as an individual. Premiums paid from a personal checking account at a bank she didn't recognize. His name on the account. No co-owner. Nothing connected to the business. Nothing connected to the trust. Clifford had no claim on it. The trust had no claim on it. Under the policy was a deed. 2 acres of land and 1 Quonset structure transferred to Nora Voss, recorded 5 years prior at the county office 2 towns over. The property had been purchased by Walter Voss in 2009 using funds from an inheritance. The estate of his paternal grandfather settled that same year. The purchase predated any joint financial account. The transfer to Nora had been filed quietly handled by an attorney whose name she didn't recognize, processed in a county office far enough away that no one who knew the Voss name would have noticed it. The transfer was legal, the deed was clean, the land was hers and had been for 5 years. She set the deed down. She picked up the letter. She held it for a moment, her name in his block print on the sealed flap. She ran her thumb across the ink. Then she broke the seal. 1 page. His writing on both sides, the lines closed but not cramped. He had written this with the same care he brought to everything he wanted done right. Nora. I know you're reading this because I'm gone, and they came for the house. I'm sorry I couldn't stop that from happening. The trust was my father's idea, and after he passed, Clifford found ways to keep control of it. Mom signed whatever was put in front of her. I tried talking to her. I tried talking to him. Neither conversation went the way I needed it to, but I could do this much. The land is yours. It has been yours for 5 years. I put it in your name through an attorney in the next county because I wanted it done clean and done quiet. The insurance I set up in 2006. You scared me that February. I sat in that hospital room and thought about what would happen to you if I went first, and the answer made me go to an agent the following week. They'll come for the house because they can, but this is yours because I made sure of it. The journal in this box, keep it. It has everything you'll need if Clifford tries to make trouble about the land or the account. I documented what I could. Dates, amounts, names. 3 separate times he used shop equipment as collateral without telling me until the notes were already signed. Twice he refinanced the house with Mom's signature on paperwork she didn't read. I stayed in the trust because walking away felt like letting the business go down, and I'd built that business with you. But I made sure you had a way out that he couldn't touch. I know you don't need me to tell you what to do next. You always figured things out faster than I did. You can run a bead, you can read a balance sheet, you know how to work, and you know how to wait, and you don't quit on things. Build something. It doesn't have to be big, it just has to be yours. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder for you inside the family. I should have. I was wrong to keep the peace at your expense, and I knew it, and I kept doing it, And I have to live with that, except I don't anymore. So I'm leaving you with it instead, and I'm sorry for that too. I love you. I have loved you since the afternoon you told me my weld looked like a caterpillar and you were right and we both knew it. Walter. Nora read the letter twice, then a third time. She folded it along the original creases, the ones Walter had pressed into it when he sealed it, and she put it in the inside pocket of her jacket against her chest. She stood at the workbench with her hands pressed flat against the steel surface and breathed. In through her nose, out through her mouth, the way Walter used to breathe when a job went wrong, and he needed to start over without taking the frustration into the next pass. Her throat was tight. Her eyes were hot. She did not cry. She stood there breathing until the tightness in her throat eased and her eyes cleared, and she could see the workbench surface again, the deed and the insurance policy laid out side by side in the fluorescent light. 3 knocks came on the steel wall. Sharp and even, the kind of knock that isn't asking permission, just announcing presence. Nora straightened. She walked to the door and pulled it open. A man stood outside in canvas work pants and boots, holding a steel thermos in one hand. White hair, weathered face, the build of someone who had spent 40 years doing physical work and never fully stopped. He had reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and was looking at her with an expression that was curious but not intrusive. The expression of someone who has learned to wait for information instead of reaching for it. Heard the grinder from my place this morning, he said. Figured it wasn't kids. He said it without apology or explanation. I'm Nora, she said. He nodded once, the way people nod when something settles into place. Deke Harmon. I've got the 5 acres next door. The place with the green metal roof. He unscrewed the thermos cap and held it toward her. Coffee. She took it. The coffee was black and strong and exactly right for a cold morning in a steel building with a concrete floor. He came inside without being asked and looked around the way a man looks at a workspace when he's assessing it, honestly, eyes moving across the welding rigs and the bench and the tool wall and the labeled hooks. Walter's place, he said. It wasn't a question. You knew him. He'd come out here evenings, weekends sometimes, said he was checking on the shop, but he'd end up here for 3-4 hours. He gestured at the MiG set up against the north wall. He talked about you, said you kept everything running, said you could read a set of books and run a bead, and you were better at both than him. Nora looked at the MiG gun in its holster on the cart. He was being generous. Deke looked at her directly. He wasn't generous about welding. If he said it, he meant it. He paused. What's happening here, Nora? You setting up or clearing out? She had not made the decision yet. She had not sat down and thought it through or listed the reasons for and against or considered her options the way she would normally consider a significant commitment. But the word came out before she could arrive at it through any other means. Setting up, she said. Deke nodded, the same way he'd nodded when she said her name. Like it fit. He told her about the electrical panel, what the current service would handle, what she'd need if she wanted to pull full load on both welding rigs simultaneously. He mentioned a compressor in his barn she could borrow until she had her own. He said his wife Willa ran the lunch counter on 2nd Street in town, and that if Nora needed a meal that hadn't come out of a gas station wrapper, she was to come in on a Monday evening after 5:30 when the grill was clean and they'd have something ready. He said all of this without excess, without performance. The way Walter would have said it. Deke left the way he'd come, walking back across the scrubland toward the green-roofed house next door, his breath rising in small clouds in the cold air. Nora stood in the bay door and watched him go. Then she turned back to the Quonset, to the tool wall, and the labeled drawers, and the 2 welding rigs, and the workbench, where the deed and the insurance policy lay side by side in the fluorescent light. She picked up the journal and set it on the shelf above the bench between a can of soapstone markers and a box of welding rod. She looked at Walter's welding hood hanging from the hook she'd set it on when she put it down to open the box. She picked it up and hung it on the empty hook at the end of the tool wall, the one with no label beneath it. She found a soapstone marker in the can, uncapped it, and wrote on the pegboard in block letters not as careful as Walter's, but close enough. She wrote Nora, then she went to work, 3 days of cleaning. Nora started before the sun was fully up each morning and stopped when the light through the small windows went amber and the cold came up hard through the concrete. She swept the floor twice a day, running the push broom in long, overlapping strokes until the steel shavings and the grit and the years of fine dust that had settled into the low places were gone. She wiped down the workbench surface with mineral spirits on a shop rag, working from back to front, lifting each tool and setting it back in its labeled place. She inventoried the welding rod by type and diameter, arranged the MIG spools on the upper shelf of the rack she built from angle iron she found stacked against the back wall, and organized the stick electrodes below in labeled coffee cans, the way Walter had taught her decades ago when the first shop was nothing but a leased garage bay on Route 9 with 40-amp service and a folding table for a desk. By the third evening, the Quonset looked the way a working shop is supposed to look. Not new, not clean the way something untouched is clean. Clean the way something used and cared for is clean, which is a different thing entirely and takes longer to achieve. Deke came by each morning with a thermos. He never stayed long. He would pour coffee into the cap and hand it to her. Look around at whatever progress the previous day had produced. Say something specific and practical. The compressor line should run along the south wall to keep it out of the work path. The fluorescent tube above the secondary bench was flickering and needed a new starter. There was a used plasma table at an estate sale in the next county on Saturday if she wanted to come look at it. Then he would go back across the scrubland to the green-roofed house without making it a longer visit than it needed to be. On the fourth day, she heard a diesel pickup on the dirt track. She was at the grinder finishing a practice bead on scrap plate when the truck pulled up outside. A rancher climbed out in a sweat-stained canvas hat and boots, with dried clay packed into the lugs. He walked straight into the Quonset without stopping at the door, the way men who work outdoors walk into buildings directly and without ceremony. "You, Nora," he said. "I am. Name's Earl Pickett. I've got a livestock trailer with a cracked frame rail. Hauled calves on it last week and the whole rear end was swaying on the highway. Somebody at the co-op said you were set up out here." Nora set down the grinder and pulled up her hood. "Pull it around and let me look." The crack ran 14 inches along the bottom rail on the driver's side. Clean fracture, no rust penetration yet. She could see the stress pattern in the metal around it, the way the load had worked at that point over time before it finally let go. "I can fix that," she said. $80. Pickett squinted from under the brim of his hat. "That's less than half what Voss Custom quoted me last spring." "I'm not Voss Custom," Nora said. He left the trailer and drove off without another word. She ground out the crack, beveled both sides at 30 degrees, and ran a root pass with 7018 rod, letting the puddle fill clean before she moved. Then a fill pass. Then a cap pass she ground flush and painted with cold galvanizing compound while the steel was still warm enough to help adhesion. She called Pickett when she was done. 3 hours start to finish. He came back and walked around the trailer twice. Got down on one knee and looked at the underside of the repair from below, the way a man looks at work he's going to trust his livelihood to. "That's cleaner than what's on the rest of this trailer," he said. "That's because the rest was done in a factory," Nora said. "Factories are fast. Fast isn't always clean." Pickett paid in cash. 420s. Nora's first income since Walter died. She opened the spiral notebook on the workbench and wrote the entry. Date, customer name, job description, materials, used hours, amount received. She had kept books this way since 1991. Paper first, then the ledger, then the accounting software, but always the paper notebook first because paper doesn't crash and doesn't need a password and doesn't change the format on you without asking. She wrote Pickett E trailer frame repair, 14-inch crack, bottom rail DS, 7018 root /fill /cap cold galvanized. 3 hours, $80 cash. Then she looked at the entry for a moment and wrote below it smaller first one. Pickett told his neighbors told theirs. Within 10 days, she had a cattle guard to repair 2 custom driveway gates for a horse property east of town and a feed trough with a rotted-out bottom that needed new plate welded in. The jobs were small, $50 here, $120 there, but they came in a steady trickle, and they were real, and they required competence. And she had competence to give. Word travels in both directions in a small county. She heard through Deke that two contractors in town had complained about billing problems at Voss Custom Metalworks. Clifford was running the front office himself now. Nobody was answering the phone half the time. An invoice had gone out twice for the same job with different totals. A parts supplier had put the account on notice. Nora didn't comment when Deke told her. She turned back to the gate panel she was tacking and kept her eyes on the puddle. "Not your problem," Deke said. "No," she said. "It's not." The following Friday, Deke brought Willa. Willa Harmon was a small woman with silver hair, cut close, and a handshake that told you everything you needed to know about her inside the first 3 seconds. She walked into the Quonset and looked at the tool wall and the workbench and the hand-lettered price list Nora had taped to the wall beside the door. And she looked at all of it with the evaluating eye of someone who had run a business herself for 22 years and knew what a functioning operation looked like versus what a struggling one pretended to look like. "You eat," Willa said. "When I remember to. That's what I figured." She pulled a foil-wrapped plate from the canvas bag over her shoulder. "Pot roast, sweet potatoes, green beans from my garden last summer." She set it on the corner of the workbench. "Don't get sentimental about it. I need a gate for the dumpster enclosure behind my counter. Raccoons have been getting in since September and I'm tired of it. I can build a gate. 4 feet wide. Something a raccoon can't climb or squeeze through. Needs to swing both ways so I can push it open with my hip when my hands are full of trash bags. I'll come measure it Monday. Come at 6. I'll feed you. Grills off by 5:30 on Mondays." That first Monday dinner at Willa's counter became a standing arrangement without either of them formally proposing it. Nora would show up at 6, the chairs already stacked on the other 7 tables, a plate waiting at the corner booth Willa called the family booth. They would eat while Nora sketched gate designs on paper napkins, and Willa told her which design would actually work for a woman carrying 2 full trash bags in the dark with the motion sensor light pointed the wrong direction. Nora built the gate in 4 hours. 1/4-inch square tube frame, 8-inch expanded metal panels so you could see through it but couldn't reach through it. Double action hinges set at the right tension so it swung both ways and stopped itself. A gravity latch that closed automatically but could be bumped open with a forearm. She delivered it on a Thursday morning and installed it herself. Willa stood in the alley behind the counter and watched her set the hinges and hang the gate and test the swing 3 times to make sure it moved the same way in both directions. "That'll hold," Willa said. "It'll hold," Nora agreed. Willa paid her in pot roast the following Friday, which was the arrangement they had made, and Nora accepted it in the spirit it was offered. By the second week of Friday dinners, Deke had started coming too. By the third week, Willa had stopped letting Nora sit at the counter and moved her to the corner booth permanently. "That's the family booth," Nora said the first time. "It is," Willa said, and set the plates down and went back to the kitchen. The card Nora pinned to the board at Willa's counter was simple. Index card block letters, Voss Ironworks welder apprentice, wanted will train. She had thought for a long time about the name for the shop. She had sat with several options across several evenings at the workbench before she came back to Voss. Not because of Clifford, not because of the trust, because she had been Nora Voss for 33 years, and Walter had been a Voss, and the work they had built together carried that name, and she wasn't going to let Clifford take the name from her the way he'd taken the shop. Voss Ironworks. Clean, simple, not a question. The card had been on the board for 11 days when she saw him. She was at the bench one late afternoon adjusting a gate panel for the horse property, marking cut lines on a length of square tube with a soapstone marker, when she looked up through the open bay door and saw a young man standing on the shoulder of the county road. He had a duffel bag over one shoulder, and he was reading the sign she had welded and posted at the end of the dirt track the week before. Standing still, reading it carefully, the way someone reads something they want to make sure they've understood correctly before they act on it. She stepped to the door. "Can I help you?" He turned, mid-20s, lean with dark hair cut short, and a face that carried more years than his age should have put there. He wore a canvas work jacket too light for November, and boots that had seen significant use. His hands hung at his sides, and she could see from where she stood that his palms were calloused, the kind of callous that comes from sustained physical work rather than occasional effort. He didn't move from the shoulder of the road. Saw a card at the lunch counter in town, he said. Said you train. That's what it said. My name is Leland Pruitt. I've been in town 4 days. I'm staying at the motel off the highway. You have welding experience. Some. Shop class in high school. I can run a bead, but it's been a while. Nora looked at him. He stood still while she looked. Didn't shift his weight or look away or fill the silence with anything extra. He just waited, and in the waiting, she saw something she recognized. The stillness of a person who has learned that talking more doesn't help. Come inside, she said. Leland followed her into the Quonset. He set his duffel by the door and looked around the shop without touching anything. His eyes moved across the tool wall the way Walter's eyes used to move across a new workspace, systematically, respectfully taking it in without grabbing at it. He stopped at the welding station. Nora handed him a spare hood from the rack. Put this on, she said. I want to see what you've got. She clamped a piece of scrap flat bar to the welding table and pointed at the MIG gun. Run me a straight bead, end to end. Don't rush it. Leland pulled the hood down, picked up the gun, and struck an arc. The bead started reasonably enough, but wandered within the first 3 inches, going cold on one side, and then overcorrecting hot. He reached the end and flipped the hood up. The weld looked like something a nervous person had made. Nora picked up the flat bar and turned it over. She ran a finger along the back side, feeling the penetration through the base metal. Your travel speed changes every 2 inches, she said. You're tensing up in your wrist. Your gun angle is 15 degrees off vertical, and you're holding your breath. Leland looked at the weld. He didn't argue, didn't explain. He just looked at it with the honest eyes of someone who knows the difference between an excuse and a reason and isn't interested in either one right now. Can I try again, he said. Nora clamped another piece of scrap. Go. The second bead was better. Still rough at the start, but steadier through the middle, and she could see his shoulders drop partway through the tension going out of them as he found the rhythm. He was breathing this time. Better, Nora said. You can start Monday, 7 to 4, $12 an hour while you're learning. When you can pass a visual inspection on a fillet weld, we'll talk about a raise. Leland looked at her. 12 an hour, he said, like he was making sure he'd heard correctly. That's the number. I'll be here at 6:30. I said 7. I know. Nora almost smiled. She noticed it happening and let it pass without showing it, but it was there. Leland showed up Monday at 6:40. Nora was already there, coffee on the hot plate Deke had brought over the day's work orders written on the board she had mounted beside the door. She poured Leland a cup without being asked and started the first lesson before he had finished it. Welding is heat control, she said. Everything else is knowing where to put it. She set up a T-joint with 2 pieces of angle iron and ran him a fillet weld, slow and deliberate, letting him watch her hands and her body position and the angle of the gun and the way she watched the puddle and not the wire. Then she had him try. His first attempt was lumpy and inconsistent, the kind of weld you grind off and call practice. You're watching the wire, she said. Watch the puddle. The wire feeds itself. You control where the heat goes. The puddle tells you everything. He tried again. She could see him thinking, adjusting, making the conscious effort to shift his focus to the right place. How long did it take you, he said. She thought about it. Walter started teaching me in 1993. I fought him on it for the first 6 months because I was convinced I was going to burn the building down. What changed? He told me the building was insured and to keep practicing. Leland almost smiled. Like her earlier, he let it pass without quite arriving. He turned back to this bench and struck another arc. By the end of the first week, Leland's welds were consistent enough that she started him on small repair work. A broken bracket for the feed store, a cracked trailer coupler for a rancher south of town. She stood back and watched him work and said what needed to be said and didn't say what didn't. Grind that spatter before you paint it. Like this, she adjusted his angle on the flap disc flatter. Let the disc do the work. You're not fighting the metal. He eased off. the finish smoothed out. He ran his thumb along the cleaned weld the way a real welder does, checking with touch, because touch catches what eyes miss. Walter had told her that. Said the hands know things the eyes are too busy to notice. Leland never talked much about himself. She learned things over time in the spaces between work. He had aged out of foster care at 18. He told her that on his third day while they were eating sandwiches at the bench during the half hour she allowed for lunch. 7 placements, he said when she asked. 3 decent ones. 4 that were just a place to sleep. She didn't push further. He would tell her the rest when it was ready to be told. What she noticed was what she could see directly. He cleaned the shop at the end of every day without being asked. He checked the gas levels on the tanks each morning and wrote the readings in the consumables log. He organized the scrap bin by metal type because he observed her separating mild steel from stainless and started doing it himself without comment. One evening, she came back to the Quonset for a clamp she'd left behind and found him after hours at the welding station, practicing overhead welds on a piece of plate clamped in the jig. Slag was falling into his collar. He didn't flinch. He kept the bead moving. "You don't have to stay late," she said from the doorway. "I know," he said, and didn't stop. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered to the Quonset address, which was the only address Nora had anymore. A law firm letterhead she didn't recognize 2 towns over. She read it standing at the workbench while Leland worked on the cattle guard repair outside. Warren Holt had filed a lis pendens on the property. Clifford's claim was specific. The letter argued that Walter Voss had purchased the 2-acre parcel using funds commingled with the joint marital account, and that the subsequent transfer of the deed to Nora Voss constituted a fraudulent conveyance, a transfer designed to remove assets from the reach of the trust and its beneficiaries. The claim further alleged that the life insurance policy had been funded through payroll accounts that ran through Voss Custom Metalworks, making the proceeds a trust asset. If the claim succeeded, Nora would lose the land, the Quonset, and the insurance money. She had 45 days to respond. She set the letter down on the workbench. She picked up her coffee cup and found it empty. She set it down again. Outside, she could hear the steady rhythm of Leland's grinder on the cattle guard frame. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the building, in the smell of metal and cutting oil that had become in 3 weeks the smell of her own daily life. And she looked at the shelf above the workbench where Walter's journal sat between the soapstone can and the welding rod. She took it down. She had looked through it once before quickly, in the first days after she had opened the steel box, and had seen enough to understand the general shape of what it contained. Now she read it carefully, from the beginning. Every entry, every page. Walter had started the journal 8 years ago. His block print dated and methodical, the same hand as the labels on the tool wall. The first entry described a conversation with Clifford about a property deal, the particulars of a parcel option Clifford had taken in the adjacent county. The second entry, a week later, described a call from a lender Nora didn't recognize, asking about the current value of the welding equipment at Voss Custom Metalworks. Asking specifically about the Miller welding rigs, the plasma table, the work truck. Walter wrote, did not authorize this inquiry. Called Clifford. He said it was routine due diligence for a business line of credit. He said it wouldn't affect operations. He said not to worry about it. Then a month later received notice that a lien had been filed against the shop equipment. Clifford had pledged the Miller 350, the plasma table, the F350 work truck, and 18 months of receivables as collateral against a development loan for the parcel option. He had done this with a signature page that included my name. I did not sign this document. My signature on it does not match my signature. I have the lender's notice. I have copied it here. And below it, a facsimile of the notice folded and pressed flat, taped to the page. Nora sat with the journal for 2 full hours. She read it the way she read a set of books when she was reconciling an account that wasn't adding up, systematically marking the discrepancies, tracing each entry back to a source document. Walter had done his work carefully. He had kept copies of everything. He had written dates and amounts and the names of the lenders. 3 separate instances of Clifford pledging shop assets as collateral without authorization. 2 refinances on the family home with Agnes's signature on paperwork she hadn't read. The second refinance at a rate that made Nora's chest tighten when she saw the number written out in Walter's careful block print. And then, near the middle of the journal, an entry with a different quality than the others. Dated 4 years ago. Short. Written with the deliberate calm of a man who had made a decision and was recording it. Spoke to Dennis Aldrich today, attorney in Millhaven. Brought the deed for the Quonset property and the insurance policy documents. He confirmed the property is clean purchased with inheritance funds in my name alone, not commingled with any joint account, never transferred into the trust. The list pendants Clifford might file would fail on the merits. Aldrich has copies of everything. He knows to contact Nora if anything happens to me before I can tell her myself. She read the entry twice. Then she looked up the name Dennis Aldrich in the county directory on her phone. He answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "I've been expecting your call." He had the files. Everything. The original purchase documents for the land, the bank statements showing the inheritance deposit, and the subsequent property payment. The insurance policy's funding records showing premiums paid from a personal account established 3 years before the marriage. An account that had never intersected with any business account or joint account in any documentation Aldrich had reviewed. Clifford's claim had no foundation. "You'll want a local attorney to file the response," Aldrich told her. "But I can give you everything they'll need to make it airtight." Walter was very thorough. She hired a woman named Frances Webb out of the county seat who read the Aldrich file, read the list pendants, and told Nora over the phone in a tone that suggested she had seen worse, but not by much, that she would have a response ready within the week. 23 days later, Clifford's claim was dismissed. Frances Webb called to tell her the judge had not been generous in his language about the merits of the filing. Nora thanked her and hung up and went back to the gate panel she was working on. She told Deke that evening when he came by with the thermos. He nodded once, like he had expected it. She told Willa at dinner on Friday. Willa set down her fork and looked at Nora for a moment. "Good," Willa said. She picked up her fork again. She did not tell Leland because it wasn't his business, but he heard something in the quality of the shop that week settling a steadiness that hadn't been there the week before, and he worked without asking questions about it, which was the right thing to do. It was 2 weeks after the dismissal that Leland's first solo job went wrong. A rancher named Pete Gundry had called the shop, specifically requesting the kid his words, after Leland had repaired a bent drawbar on his loader tractor the previous week, and Pete had been satisfied with the work. The job this time was a set of custom driveway gates for Pete's property, 2 panels decorative scroll work at the top rail specified in the work order Nora had written up and gone over with Leland twice. She handed Leland the truck keys on a Thursday morning. "Measurements are in a folder on the seat," she said. "Pete wants them hung on site. You've got the portable rig. You're not coming. You don't need me for a gate hang." He loaded the truck and drove out at 7. He wasn't back by noon. She assumed it was taking longer than expected, which was normal for a first solo install on an unfamiliar property. He wasn't back by 2. At 3:15, her phone rang. It was Pete Gundry. "The gates don't close right," Pete said. "The right panel is binding at the latch. In the scroll work on the left panel, one of the scroll ends came loose when I swung it hard. Just popped right off the top rail." Nora asked the question she needed to ask. She thanked Pete and told him she would have it corrected before end of day. She tried Leland's phone. No answer. She tried twice more over the following hour. No answer each time. She loaded her own tools into the bed of the truck and drove to Pete Gundry's property herself. Leland was not there. The gates were hung on their posts, and the problem was immediately visible. The right panel had been hung a 1/4 inch high on the hinge side, which put the latch out of alignment when the gate swung to close, and one of the decorative scroll elements on the left panel had been tacked rather than fully welded and had sheared off at the base when Pete swung the gate with any force behind it. Nora set her hood on and got to work. She pulled the right panel off its hinges, reset the top hinge a 1/4 inch lower, rehung it, checked the swing and the latch alignment. Clean. Then she re-welded the scroll element with a proper fill pass and ground the cap smooth and wire brushed it to match the surrounding metal. She was loading her tools back into the truck when Pete came out of the house. "Looks right now," he said. "It is right," Nora said. "The kid, he—" "Okay, I'll find out," Nora said. She drove to the motel off the highway. His number was still going to voicemail. She went to the front desk, gave them Leland's name, asked which room. The clerk told her checkout had been at noon. She sat in the truck in the motel parking lot for a moment and thought about where a 24-year-old with a duffel bag and no fixed address goes when something goes wrong. She drove back to the county road and turned east, and at the end of a gravel track behind the grain elevator, there was a small park with a couple of weathered picnic tables that nobody used in November. She had seen Leland sitting there on his lunch break 2 weeks back, just sitting alone with his sandwich, looking out at the fields the way someone looks at open space when they've spent most of their life in places that didn't have enough of it. He was there, sitting at the far table with his duffel bag on the bench beside him and his welding hood in his lap, turning it over in his hands the way a person handles something they're not sure whether to keep. Nora parked the truck and walked over. She didn't sit down. She stood at the end of the table and looked at him. He looked at the ground. "I know," he said. "I know. I messed it up and I ran. That's what I do." He said it without self-pity, just fact. The same way he'd looked at his first bad weld, honest, no excuses, and no particular hope that honesty would change anything. Nora didn't say anything for a moment. Then she turned and walked back to the truck. She opened the passenger door. "Get in," she said. He looked up. "We're going back to fix it," she said. "I already reset the hinge and rewelded the scroll. But you're going to look at what I did, and you're going to understand why I did it that way. And then you're going to rehang the left panel yourself because I set it a 1/4 inch low on purpose, and it needs to come up." Leland stared at her. "Get in," she said again. He picked up his duffel and his hood and got in the truck. They drove to Pete Gundry's in silence. At the gate, Nora pointed out the repair she'd made on the right panel, walked him through the hinge adjustment, showed him where the alignment had been off, and exactly why that 1/4 inch translated into a binding latch when the gate swung closed under its own weight. Then she pointed at the left panel. 1/4 inch low on the hinge side. Fix it. He looked at the gate. He looked at the alignment. He pulled the panel off its hinges, made the adjustment with the deliberateness of someone concentrating on getting a thing right rather than getting it done, rehung it, swung it twice. It latched clean both times. He stood back and looked at it. "How'd you know I'd be at the park?" he said. "I didn't," she said, "but I knew you wouldn't be far." They drove back to the Quonset. Leland sat in the passenger seat with his hands on his knees and didn't speak for the first 10 minutes on the county road. Then he said, 7 placements. Every time something went wrong at a placement, I'd be gone before they could send me back themselves. Beat them to it. Seemed easier. Nora kept her eyes on the road. "Walter used to say that the hardest weld to learn is the one you've already burned wrong twice," she said. "Because your hands want to do it the wrong way. They've memorized it. You have to make them learn something new on top of what they already know is wrong." Leland was quiet for a moment. "Did you ever burn one wrong twice?" he said. "I burned one wrong 11 times on the same joint," she said. "Walter made me grind it out and start over every single time. He never let me skip ahead. He said the joint was already there. It wasn't going anywhere. The only thing that mattered was whether I was willing to stay with it." She turned onto the dirt track toward the Quonset. "Monday at 7, she said. He nodded. 6:30, he said. 7, she said. He almost smiled again, and this time she let herself see it. The strip mall died on a Wednesday. Nora heard about it the way she heard about most things in that county sideways, through someone who wasn't directly involved. A contractor named Bill Stover brought in a set of stair railings for finish grinding and mentioned it while she wrote up his work ticket the offhand way people mention things they assume you already know. "Heard Clifford's development project fell through," Bill said. "Investors pulled out last week. Something about road access." Nora wrote the job number on the ticket and tore off his copy. Bill took it and left. That evening, Deke came by with a thermos and filled in the rest. He had heard it from a man at the hardware store who knew one of the investors. Without a guaranteed easement through Nora's 2 acres, The county would not approve the site access plan. The primary road into the 40-acre parcel ran directly through the corner of her property, and without that road access, the development couldn't be permitted. And without the permit, the financing structure collapsed. And the investors had decided they wanted their commitment fees returned rather than wait for Clifford to find an alternative route that didn't exist. He leveraged the trust property against the deal, Deke said. He was sitting in the folding chair by the secondary bench, both hands around the thermos. The old shop equipment, some of the receivables, in the house. Nora set down her pen. He put Agnes's house up, she said. That's what I heard. She looked at the workbench surface. The day's invoices were spread out in front of her, a clean and orderly row of numbers that added up the way numbers were supposed to add up when someone was paying attention to them. She thought about Agnes's house, the camel-colored coat, the practical, absent way Agnes had handed her a garbage bag from the car window. How bad, she said. Bad enough that he's going to have to make a call he doesn't want to make, Deke said. She nodded once and went back to the invoices. 2 days later, she got the call herself. Her cell rang at 9 in the evening while she was at the workbench reconciling the month's accounts. She looked at the screen. Clifford. She let it ring 3 times before she answered. There was a pause on his end before he spoke, the pause of someone who had been rehearsing what to say and lost the rehearsed version when the line opened. Nora, he said, I need to talk to you. Not about the land, not about the easement. That's done. I understand that. I just need to talk. Can I come by tomorrow? Nora looked at the workshop. The 12 gate panels for the subdivision contract were lined up along the far wall, finished and waiting for pickup. The welding table was clear. Leland's hood hung on its hook beside hers. The journal sat on the shelf between the soapstone can and the welding rod where she'd kept it since the day she opened the steel box. I'll be here at 7, she said. She put the phone down. She didn't sleep much that night. She sat in the camp chair by the workbench with the phone in her lap and listened to the Quonsets settle around her in the cold, the steel walls ticking as the temperature dropped, outside the small sounds of a building that had been standing alone in a field for 30 years and knew how to be still. She thought about Walter staying in the trust for 2 decades, staying through all of it, making payroll and covering the shop's obligations, and watching Clifford drain equity from the other side, and writing it all down in a journal he kept in a locked steel box in a building nobody knew about. He had stayed because he'd built the business with her, and walking away from something you'd built felt like giving up on it. She had already walked away. She had built something else. She thought about that distinction for a long time, what it meant and what it didn't, and when she finally set the phone down on the workbench and closed her eyes in the chair, the cold around her felt less like something to endure and more like something neutral, just the temperature of the world doing what the world does in November. Morning came in gray and slow. She was at the hot plate by 6 boiling water for coffee in the steel cup that had become her standard morning vessel, standing at the open bay door, looking out at the 2 acres of scrubland turning pale gold in the early light. The goldenrod had gone silver with frost overnight. The chain-link fence caught the frost and held it in a long, glittering line along the property edge. Clifford's car came up the dirt track at 7:10. She heard it before she saw it, the Audi's engine too smooth for the frozen ruts. It crunched to a stop outside the gate. He got out slowly. She had not seen him since he had come to offer her $120,000 for the property, and before that, since the morning with the locksmith. He looked older than the last time. Not in years, but in something else, the way a face changes when the structure behind it shifts and the performance that used to hold it up is no longer available. His hair needed cutting. He wore a flannel shirt and dark pants and no jacket despite the cold. And she had never seen Clifford Voss in flannel in 33 years of knowing him. He walked through this gate and stopped 10 feet from the door. Come in, she said. He came inside and sat on the stool by the secondary bench, the one Leland used. He looked at the tool wall. He looked at the gate panels lined along the far wall. He looked at the wedding photo she had hung above the workbench on a nail Walter had driven into the wall years ago. For a reason, she had never known Walter and Nora on the courthouse steps, both of them squinting into the afternoon sun. Walter in his good shirt, Nora in a white dress she had bought that morning from a department store because she hadn't planned far enough ahead to do it any other way. Clifford looked at the photo for a long time. Then he looked at his own hands resting on his knees. "The shop is in trouble," he said. "Not the land deal, the actual welding shop. The men I hired are adequate, but they don't know the clients. They don't know who needs a call before the job starts, and who just wants the invoice when it's done, and who will wait 60 days, and who needs to be followed up with at 30, or they'll go somewhere else." He rubbed the side of his face with one hand. "The billing is a mess. I've got receivables out past 90 days on accounts that should have been collected at 30. I've got a parts supplier threatening to put us on cash only because I missed 2 payments I didn't even know were due." "That's a bookkeeping problem," Nora said. "It's an everything problem." He dropped his hands to his knees again. "The 40-acre deal is dead. My investors are talking to an attorney, not about renegotiating, about recovering their commitment fees. And Patricia went to her sister's place in Tulsa 3 weeks ago. She's not answering my calls." The shop was quiet. Outside, a meadowlark called from somewhere along the fence line. 2 notes, then silence. "Mom doesn't always know who I am anymore," Clifford said. "She called me Walter twice on Sunday. Then she asked me where Dad was. Dad's been gone since 1982. "I'm sorry about Agnes," Nora said. He looked at the wedding photo again. "I'm not here to ask for money," he said. "I'm not here about the land." He seemed to be working through a list of things he'd told himself before he came clearing them away one at a time so he could get to the thing underneath. When he spoke again, his voice was rough in a way she didn't recognize from any version of Clifford she had known. "What would Walter have done?" he said. The question settled into the room and sat there. Nora looked at him. She had known Clifford Voss for 33 years. She had watched him work a room and charm a contractor and talk his mother into signing documents on the hood of his car in the driveway. She had watched him be plausible and persuasive and relentlessly forward-moving in the direction of his own advantage. She had watched him in her kitchen with a locksmith on the porch and a lawyer at her table and a garbage bag that Agnes had produced from the back seat like it was a reasonable thing to do. She looked at him now and tried to find the angle, the strategy underneath the question, the play she hadn't seen yet. She couldn't find one. He just looked tired and scared and older than 54 in the way that men look older than they are when the version of themselves they've been performing for decades stops being available to them. She went to the shelf above the workbench. She took down the journal. She set it on the bench between them and opened it to the first entry she had marked with a strip of welding wire. "Read this," she said. He looked at the page. Walter's block print, the date in the upper left corner, the careful accounting of a conversation about a property deal and a call from an unfamiliar lender. Clifford's face didn't change at first. He read the way a person reads something they're trying to find a way to dismiss. Then he turned the page and read the next entry, and the next. Nora stepped back and let him read. She poured a second cup of coffee from the hot plate and stood at the far end of the bench and watched his face. She watched the moment when the dismissal left it. She watched what came after, not guilt exactly, because guilt is a feeling, and what she saw looked more like comprehension. The particular look of a man understanding the full size of something he had only seen part of before, and thinking about what that means for everything that came after it. He turned pages. He read slowly. He stopped at the entry about the unauthorized lien and read it twice. He stopped at the entry about Agnes signing the refinance paperwork and put his hand flat on the page for a moment before he turned it. He read for 20 minutes. When he set the journal down, he didn't say anything right away. He put both hands on the bench and leaned on them and looked at the open page in front of him. He knew, Clifford said. He knew all of it. He documented all of it, Nora said. Clifford was quiet for a long moment, and he never said anything. He never came to me and said his voice stopped. He just kept covering the shop. He kept hoping you'd stop on your own, Nora said, and he kept the shop from going under while he waited. That was Walter. Clifford closed the journal. He didn't push it back toward her. He just left it on the bench between them and looked at the cover. When he spoke again, his voice was lower. "I always told myself the business would have collapsed without the capital I was bringing in through the property deals," he said. that I was doing it for the family, building something bigger. He looked at the journal cover and then looked away from it. I told myself that for a long time. Nora didn't respond to that. He looked up at the wedding photo again, looked at his brother's face in it squinting into the sun on the courthouse steps with Nora's hand in his. I want to say I'm sorry, Clifford said. I know that doesn't cover it. I'm not asking you to tell me it does. It doesn't cover it, Nora said. He nodded. He looked like he had expected that answer and had decided to come anyway, which she noted without saying anything about it. She looked at the journal on the bench. She thought about Walter writing in it at this workbench in this building over years, documenting and preserving and planning with the same patient methodology he brought to a multi-pass weld on heavy plate, not rushing any of it, not skipping steps, trusting that the preparation would matter when the time came. She picked up the journal and put it back on the shelf. I'll take over the bookkeeping for Voss Custom Metalworks, she said. Clifford looked at her. Not as a favor, she said, as a paid contractor. Standard rate, monthly invoice. I'll handle receivables, payroll, and quarterly taxes from my desk here. I'm not coming back into the family. I'm not coming to the shop. But I can keep the books straight and get the accounts current. And if I'm doing that, the business has a chance of not going under while you figure out the rest of it. He stared at her. Something shifted in his face, the comprehension she'd seen earlier moving into something she didn't have a precise name for. Something between relief and shame, which was probably the right combination for a man in his position. After what we did, he said, "This isn't about what you did," Nora said. "This is about what makes sense. That's all." He didn't answer right away. He sat on the stool and looked at the bench surface, and then at the tool wall, and then at the photo, and then back at Nora. "Okay," he said, "thank you. You'll get my first invoice on the 15th. He almost smiled. She saw it happen and not quite arrive at his face, stopping somewhere behind his eyes instead. He stood up. He picked up his keys from where he'd set them on the bench edge. He nodded once, not the salesman's nod, not the nod that means I've heard what I needed to hear, but something simpler and less practiced. He walked out of the Quonset and got into the Audi and back down the dirt track, slowly raising a thin cloud of frozen dust that the morning light turned briefly gold before it settled back into the ruts. Nora listened to the engine fade into the county road. She stood at the bench for a moment in the quiet. Then she poured a third cup of coffee and opened the Voss Custom Metalworks ledger she had requested from Clifford the previous week and got to work. The books were in the condition she had expected. Not catastrophic, Clifford had tried, which she could see in the attempts at organization, and the partial records and the good intentions visible in the structure of the filing system someone had set up and then not maintained. But badly enough out of order that it took her 3 full mornings to reconstruct the previous 4 months accurately. She found $11,000 in unbilled work. Jobs completed, clients satisfied. No invoice ever sent. She prepared the invoices herself, checked them twice, sent them out on the 15th, and had 8 of them paid within 30 days. Finding that $11,000 felt the way certain discoveries feel in a shop, like finding good metal in a pile you'd written off as scrap. The material had been there the whole time. It just needed someone to look at it properly. She called Clifford with a question about a diesel receipt in March. He found it and sent a photo within the hour. She called him about a discrepancy in the payroll records for the month after Walter died, when someone had evidently been running payroll from a spreadsheet rather than the accounting system, and the numbers had drifted apart. He answered on the first ring, listened, said he'd pull the timesheets, pulled them, sent them within 20 minutes. The Clifford on the phone was not the Clifford who had stood in her kitchen with a locksmith on the porch. She didn't know what to make of that yet, and she didn't try to make anything of it. She wrote down the numbers he gave her, verified them against the source documents, reconciled the discrepancy, and closed the file. The parts supplier dropped the cash-only threat after she sent them a payment schedule and kept to it for 60 days without exception. She did not go to the old shop. She had no reason to. The work was in the numbers, and the numbers came to her, and she did her work from the desk she had set up in the corner of the Quonset beside the filing cabinet, and the laptop with the welding station running 15 feet away, and Leland's hood hanging on its hook, and Walter's journal on the shelf above the bench. Two sets of books on the same desk. Two different shops. One closed and finding its footing again. One still becoming what it was going to be. Agnes came on a Tuesday. Nora heard a car on the dirt track around 9 in the morning and looked up from the secondary bench where she was laying out cut lines on stock for a custom handrail job. The car that pulled up outside the gate was Agnes's tan sedan, the one she kept in the garage, and only drove on clear days to destinations she knew well. Agnes got out slowly, one hand on the door frame for balance. She was wearing gray slacks and a blue cardigan and low shoes with rubber soles, and her hair was set the way she set it when she was going somewhere that required care. She held the door for a moment before releasing it, steadying herself, looking at the Quonset with the focused attention of someone making sure they know where they are before they move toward it. She was having a clear day. Nora could see it from across the yard, the difference in her eyes, the way they tracked the details of the building and the sign and the gravel path between her and the door, with the deliberate awareness of someone who had learned to pay close attention to the present moment, because the present moment was not always fully available to her anymore. Nora set down her soapstone marker and walked to the bay door. Agnes walked through the gate and into the Quonset. She stopped just inside the door and looked around. Her eyes moved across the tool wall, across the workbench, across the welding station where the machine sat dark and silent. She looked at the handrail stock on the secondary bench, the gate panels stacked in the corner, the filing cabinet, the two ledger books sitting beside the laptop on the desk. She took it in the way you look at something you want to understand, not just observe. She walked to the tool wall. She looked at the labeled hooks, Walter's block print under every one. He spent more time here than I knew, she said. He did, Nora said. Agnes walked slowly along the tool wall, reading the labels. Not touching anything, just reading. She stopped at the hook where both welding hoods hung side by side, Walter's old one, with the cracked lens that Nora had taken from the garage the morning they changed the locks, and Nora's own, the one she used every day. She looked at them for a moment. Then she walked to the workbench. She stopped in front of the wedding photo. Walter and Nora on the courthouse steps, squinting into the afternoon light, Walter's hand loosely around her shoulders and Nora's hand at his waist, and both of them smiling the particular smile of people who have just done something they believe in completely. Agnes stood in front of it for a long time. The Quonset was very quiet. Leland was at a job site south of town. The hot plate had cycled off. Outside, the November wind moved through the scrubland without urgency, and the chain-link fence made its small sound, and a crow called twice from somewhere near the road, and then went silent. I always told myself you married him for the business, Agnes said. She said it without accusation, without apology either, just a plain statement of what she had believed for a long time and was now saying out loud for the first time. It was easier to think that than to admit he chose someone we couldn't manage, that he had chosen someone who wasn't impressed by what we were impressed by and wasn't afraid of what we thought people should be afraid of. Agnes kept her eyes on the photo. Clifford was always the one I understood. He wanted the things I understood how to want. Walter wanted a welding shop and a woman who argued with me at Thanksgiving dinner. Nora stood at the far end of the workbench and said nothing. I never forgave him for that, Agnes said, for choosing his own life instead of the one I had pictured for him. She looked down at her hands. Her wedding ring sat loose on her finger, sliding toward the knuckle. I held it against you because it was easier to hold it against you than to admit that my son didn't need my approval to be happy. She looked up at the photo again. But he was happy. Wasn't he? He was, Nora said. Agnes nodded. And you kept everything running. All those years, the books and the clients and the shop. Walter told me once, this was years ago, I don't remember exactly when he said, you could look at a set of numbers and see the story in them. He said most people just see numbers. You see what the numbers mean. He said it like it was the most remarkable thing he'd ever watched anyone do. Nora's throat tightened. She breathed once slowly. He was being generous, she said. Agnes shook her head. He wasn't generous about things like that. You know he wasn't. Nora did know. Agnes turned from the photo. She looked at Nora directly the way she rarely had in 33 years, without the buffer of a dinner table or a family occasion or any of the social architecture that lets people look at each other without fully seeing what's there. You were good to him, Agnes said. Better than we deserved. Better than I deserved. Nora looked back at her. The woman was 81 years old and standing in a steel building in a scrubland field to say something she should have said 30 years ago, and the fact that it had taken this long and this much loss to get there did not make the saying of it worthless. He was good to me, Nora said. That made it easy. Agnes reached out. Her hand found Nora's arm just above the wrist. Her palm was cool and light, the touch of a woman whose hands had grown thin over the years, but the intention in it was deliberate. She held on for a moment. In 33 years of knowing each other, Agnes Voss had never touched her on purpose. Nora stood still and let the moment exist without doing anything to it. It was small. It was not enough to cover what had been done in that kitchen with the locksmith on the porch, not enough to account for 30 years of managed distance and Thanksgiving table disapproval and a garbage bag offered from a car window like it was a practical solution. It was not restitution and it was not absolution, and Nora was not looking for either. It was an old woman standing in November in a steel building telling the truth as plainly as she knew how to tell it at 81 and reaching out with what she had left to reach with. Nora put her other hand over Agnes's. They stood like that for a moment. Two women in a building that smelled like metal and cutting oil and decades of careful work. Then Agnes lowered her hand and straightened herself. I should go while the light is still good, she said. I don't drive well after dark anymore. Nora walked with her to the car. She opened the passenger door from habit, then realized Agnes had driven herself and held the driver's door instead. Agnes got in. She adjusted the seat, checked the mirror, settled her hands on the wheel with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a skill they can feel changing. She looked up at Nora through the open door. The sign is good, she said. She meant the Voss Ironworks sign at the end of the track, the one Nora had welded from quarter-inch plate and painted flat black and set in concrete on a cold October morning, with Deke standing off to the side with his arms crossed and his thermos in his hand. Walter would have liked that, Agnes said. She pulled the door shut and drove away down the dirt track, careful and slow signaling at the county road, even though there was no one behind her in either direction, the habit of a woman who had always done things the correct way even when no one was watching. Nora watched until the tan sedan disappeared around the bend in the county road. Then she went back inside and sat down at the desk. She worked through the afternoon. Leland came back at 3:30, unloaded the truck, racked the leftover stock against the east wall, wrote his job notes on the board by the door in his block print that was getting more like Walter's every week without either of them remarking on it. He looked at her once when he came in, and she looked back at him, and whatever he saw on her face made him nod once and go about his work without asking anything. Around 5 o'clock, he came to the desk with his timesheet. She signed it and handed it back. Boss, he said. She looked up. He seemed to be working out how to say something and not finding the right approach to it. You okay? He said. Yeah, she said. I'm okay. He nodded. He folded the timesheet and put it in his jacket pocket. He went to the door and took his own hood off its hook and hung it on the peg for the night. He looked back at her once from the doorway. See you Monday, he said. 6:50, she said. 6:30, he said, and walked out before she could correct him. She listened to his truck start on the county road and pull away into the late afternoon. The shop was quiet. She looked at the 2 sets of ledger books on the desk. The Voss Ironworks book on the left, 3 months of careful entries in her own hand, the numbers moving in the right direction in a way that was modest and real. The Voss Custom Metalworks book on the right, the reconstructed record of a shop finding its footing again with someone paying proper attention to it. She reconciled the day's entries and both checked the running totals, noted 2 items to follow up on Monday. Then she closed both books and sat with the quiet for a while. In the days after Agnes came, Nora noticed something that had happened without her noticing it happen. She was sitting at the bench one evening after Leland had gone working through the month's receivables, And she realized she had gone 3 full hours without thinking about the kitchen she had left behind, without thinking about the locks being changed, without thinking about the garbage bag. The anger was gone. She had not planned to let it go. She had not made a deliberate decision about forgiveness or sat with the question consciously or arrived at any resolution through intention. She had simply been working steadily every day at something that was hers, and somewhere in the work, the anger had burned itself up the way a fuel burns when it finds what it needs to combust. Not extinguished, consumed, used up by the thing it powered. Carrying it had cost her something that she hadn't measured until it was gone. Energy, attention, space in her chest that she needed for other things. Setting it down didn't change what had happened in that kitchen. It didn't revise the locksmith or the lawyer or the garbage bag. Those things were real and permanent, and she would carry the memory of them for the rest of her life. But she wasn't paying rent on the anger anymore. She looked around the workshop in the evening light. The Voss Ironworks sign on the wall. Leland's first weld certification in a cheap black frame she'd bought at the hardware store hanging beside the wedding photo. Walter's journal on the shelf beside her own books. The two welding hoods side by side on the hook above her, name his and hers, the cracked lens and the working lens. She sat with it for a while. Then she turned off the desk lamp and the bench light and the overhead fluorescents one at a time and went to the bay door and slid it shut and set the padlock. The following Friday, she drove into town at 5:30. Willa's lunch counter was on 2nd Street between the hardware store and a vacant lot that had been a hardware store annex and was now just a rectangle of cracked concrete with a chain-link fence around it. The hand-painted sign above the door had started to fade at the edges. Willa had said she was going to repaint it in the spring. Nora had told her she would cut the letters from steel plate, and that would be the end of the fading problem. Deke's truck was in the small lot beside the building, and beside it the older motorcycle Leland had bought 3 weeks ago from a man on the highway who was moving across the country and selling everything he couldn't pack. Leland had ridden it to work every day since, in whatever the weather was doing, and Nora had not commented on this because it was his vehicle and his choice, and he was 24 years old. She had made sure his health coverage through the shop was current, which was what she could do. Inside, the chairs were stacked on 6 of the 7 tables. The corner booth had a tablecloth on it, white cotton with a small pattern along the edge that she had never seen before. Nora had never seen a tablecloth on any table at this counter in all the months she'd been coming here. Willa was behind the counter with her back turned, doing something at the grill with the focused efficiency she brought to everything that happened in her kitchen. "What's the occasion?" Nora said, hanging her jacket on the hook by the door. Willa didn't turn around. "Because it's Friday and you're here," she said. "That's reason enough." Deke was already in the booth with a glass of iced tea, the county farm report folded open to the livestock prices. Leland sat across from him, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, in the middle of a story he was telling, with the particular animated quality he reserved for things that had genuinely surprised him, which wasn't much, but which mattered when it appeared. "So the man calls me about a custom weather vane," Leland was saying, "and I'm thinking the standard stuff, rooster arrow directional cross. And he says, no, I want a catfish, a channel catfish with whiskers on a pivot. And I ask how detailed, and he says very detailed, so I ask him to send me a reference photo. He goes, hold on, goes out to his truck, comes back with an actual live catfish in a cooler, sets it on my workbench. There's your reference." Deke shook his head slowly, the way a man shakes his head at something that doesn't quite surprise him, but confirms something he already suspected about the world. "I measured it," Leland said. "The fish, with calipers." Nora slid into the booth beside Deke. "Did you make it?" she said. "Making it next week." He looked at her. "Boss approved the quote." "I approved the quote," she said. He grinned. The full version this time unguarded and complete the one she had seen maybe 4 or 5 times in 3 months, in which each time looked like something working its way free from wherever it had been kept. Willa came from the kitchen with plates, fried chicken which she made on Friday evenings because she had always made fried chicken on Friday evenings and saw no reason to change a thing that worked. roasted sweet potatoes with the skins on, green beans with a piece of cured pork in the pot, the way her grandmother had made them. The recipe unchanged across 70 years and 3 generations of women who knew what they were doing in a kitchen. She set the plates down without ceremony and pulled a chair from the nearest table and sat at the end of the booth because there was no more room inside it and she wasn't going to stand. Deke told a story about a tractor engine he had rebuilt in 1977, original bearings that had run without opening the case until 2009. Leland asked him what alloy the bearing inserts were, and Deke told him, and they discussed metallurgy for 10 minutes in a back and forth that was specific and technical and completely comfortable, while Willa and Nora ate and listened and occasionally looked at each other across the table. Willa refilled the glasses when they needed it and didn't make a production of it. At some point, Deke reached over and turned on the small radio on the counter, and a country station came through with the kind of music that nobody younger than 40 is interested in, and everyone older than 60 knows every word of. It played low under the conversation, which was exactly the right volume for it. Nora looked at the three of them around the table. She thought about the word family, which was a word that had come to mean something specific and institutional and conditional to her over the years of the Voss family, and the trust and the holiday dinners and the documents. She had spent 33 years being technically part of a family that had never quite included her in the way families are supposed to include people. None of these people owed her anything. None of them were family by blood or by document or by any arrangement that had been formalized anywhere. Deke had heard a grinder on a cold November morning and brought coffee because that was the kind of man he was. Willa had needed a gate and had seen clearly that Nora needed to eat, and had made those two things into an exchange that suited both of them. Leland had been standing on the shoulder of a county road with a duffel bag and calloused hands, in the patience of someone who had learned that patience was sometimes the only thing that couldn't be taken from you, regardless of where they put you. They were here because it was Friday, and this was what they did now. After dinner, Nora drove back to the Quonset. The evening light was low and flat coming in from the west at the long angle of late November, turning the scrubland gold and the chain-link fence into a line of light along the property edge. She parked the truck and stood outside for a moment before going in the cold air that smelled like frost and dry grass and the particular nothing of open land in November. The Voss Ironworks sign caught the last of the light. Quarter-inch plate, the letters cut on the plasma table and ground smooth on all four edges, and welded to the backing plate and painted with 2 coats of flat black Rust-Oleum. She had set the posts in concrete herself on a cold morning 6 weeks ago, with Deke standing off to the side with his arms crossed in his thermos. "Looks like it'll outlast the building," he had said. "That's the idea," she had said. She slid the bay door open and stepped inside. She didn't turn on the overhead lights. The last of the evening light came through the small windows along the south wall and lay in long, pale rectangles on the concrete floor, moving slowly as the sun continued its descent outside. She walked to the workbench and stood in front of it. The 2 ledger books, the wedding photo, Leland's certification in its cheap frame, Walter's journal on the shelf, the 2 welding hoods side by side on the hook above her name, both of them catching a little of the fading light. She thought about Walter writing that letter in this building, at this bench, pressing the creases in carefully before he sealed it and put it in the box. She thought about him running that bead around the steel box. 3 passes, good penetration. The ripple he never quite trained out, the one he'd called his signature, the one she'd teased him about for 33 years, and would recognize anywhere in any metal, in any shop, in any county, in any state she ever found herself standing in. She put her hand flat on the workbench surface. The steel was cold from the November night. She had come here with a garbage bag full of shoes and a truck nobody had thought to claim and a small brass key she had never been given an explanation for. She had opened a box and found a letter and a plan built quietly over years by a man who had understood what she would need and had made sure it was here before he left. Build something he had written. She had built something. Not because he told her to, though that had mattered more than she could easily say. Not because she wanted to prove anything to Clifford or Agnes or anyone who had stood in that kitchen or handed her that bag. She had built it because she knew how, because she had always known how and had been building things for other people for so long that the act of building something that was hers alone felt at first unfamiliar and then gradually like the thing she had always been moving toward without knowing she was moving toward it. The work had been the answer, not the money, not the property, not winning anything. The work itself done well every day in a building that smelled like cutting oil and her husband's careful hands. She stood at the bench in the last light until the light was entirely gone and the shop was dark around her, except for the faint ambient glow coming through the small windows from the night sky. Then she turned and walked to the bay door and slid it shut and set the padlock. The county road was quiet. A truck passed heading north, its headlights sweeping briefly across the Quonset walls in a moving bar of light. And then it was gone, and the night settled back around the property. The frost-silvered goldenrod, and the chain-link fence, and the sign at the end of the dirt track that would still be standing, she intended long after everything else out here had changed. Home isn't what they give you. It's what you build when they take everything.